The smoke rose black against the Wyoming sky that October morning in 1892, and Catherine Morrison knew her world was ending. She stood at her kitchen window, flour still dusting her apron from the morning biscuits, watching flames devour the Johnson homestead 3 miles east. The crackle of gunfire echoed across Clearwater Valley like deadly thunder, and somewhere between the barn and the house, her husband James lay buried beneath 6 feet of prairie soil, taken by fever just 2 months prior. Before we jump back tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Her 5 children huddled behind her, sensing the danger their mother couldn't hide. Samuel, 14 and trying so hard to be the man of the house, gripped his father's old rifle with hands that shook despite his efforts. Maggie, 12, held little Danny close while Rose clung to her skirts. Billy, 9 years old and full of questions, kept asking why the men were shooting at each other, why the sky looked angry, why Mama's face had gone so pale. Kate Morrison had buried one dream already. She wouldn't bury her children, too. The range war had been brewing for months, splitting Clearwater Valley down the middle like an axe through kindling. On one side stood Henry Walsh and his cattlemen's association, men who claimed the open range by right of first possession and the size of their herds. On the other, Jacob Stone led the Homesteaders Alliance, families like Kate's who'd filed claims under the Homestead Act, determined to fence their plots and farm the land their sweat had earned. James Morrison had tried to stay neutral, working his modest spread and raising his children far from the politics that consumed their neighbors. But neutrality, Kate was learning, offered no protection when bullets started flying and barns started burning. The morning James Morrison died of the fever, Kate had stood over his grave and made promises she wasn't sure she could keep. She'd promised to hold on to their land, to raise their children strong, to make the life they'd dreamed of work somehow. 2 months later, those promises felt as fragile as autumn leaves. The Morrison homestead sat on 160 acres of good grazing land along Sweetwater River, close enough to the Blue Ridge Mountains to catch the morning shade and far enough from town to offer the privacy James had craved. It wasn't the biggest spread in Clearwater Valley, but the soil was rich, the water ran clean, and there was room enough for 5 children to grow up with dirt under their fingernails and freedom in their hearts. But freedom, Kate was learning, came with a price that kept rising. The trouble had started small, the way most troubles do. A fence cut here, cattle wandering where they shouldn't there. Henry Walsh's men claimed the homesteaders were stealing water rights that belonged to the open range. Jacob Stone's people insisted the cattlemen were trying to drive out legal settlers with intimidation and sabotage. Both sides spoke of justice and rights while their hands moved closer to their guns. Kate had tried to keep her family clear of the mounting tensions. When Henry Walsh rode up to her door offering to buy her out at half the land's worth, she'd politely declined. When Jacob Stone's men came asking her to join their alliance against the cattle barons, she'd served them coffee and sent them away with kind words, but no commitments. She was a widow with 5 children, she'd told them both. She had no time for wars. Time, as it turned out, had no patience for her neutrality. The first real violence came on a Tuesday. The Peters family, homesteaders who'd settled 2 valleys over, found their well poisoned and their crops trampled by cattle driven through their fields in the dead of night. When Carl Peters rode to town to file a complaint with Sheriff Coleman, Henry Walsh's foreman met him on Main Street with hard words and harder fists. By the time the dust settled, Peters was laid up with a broken arm and Walsh's man was nursing cracked ribs, but the message was clear enough for everyone to read. Pick a side or get picked off. Kate Morrison had other concerns that pressed more immediate than range politics. Samuel was growing fast, his clothes tight across shoulders that were trying to fill out like his father's had. Maggie was becoming a young woman, her help with the younger children invaluable, but her need for guidance growing daily. Billy asked questions about everything from why grass grew green to why men fought over land that belonged to God anyway. Rose was learning to read, her small finger tracing words in the Bible Kate read to them each evening. And Danny, sweet Danny, was barely past toddling but smart as a whip and into everything his small hands could reach. Feeding 5 growing children on a homestead that produced more hope than income required every hour of Kate's day and most of her night. She rose before dawn to milk their 2 cows, gathered eggs from the chickens that hadn't been taken by foxes or failing to lay, and spent her days cooking, mending, teaching, and holding together the fragile structure of their daily life. The garden provided vegetables through the growing season, but winter was coming fast, and their stores weren't what they should have been. James had been the one who understood cattle and crops, who could read the weather in the color of the sky and know when to plant or harvest or hunker down for storms. Kate was learning these skills through necessity and error, but learning fast wasn't always fast enough when 5 children depended on getting it right. The night before the range war exploded into open violence, Kate sat at her kitchen table, working sums that wouldn't balance no matter how many times she reworked them. The mortgage payment was due in 3 weeks. The supply order for winter provisions would take most of what remained in James's tin box under the floorboards. If one of the children got sick, if the cow went dry, if any one of a dozen small disasters struck their careful balance, they'd be facing choices no mother should have to make. Samuel found her there when he came in from checking the animals, her head in her hands and the papers scattered across the table like accusations. "Mama," he said, his voice careful in the way of children who've learned to read their parents' moods. "Everything all right?" Kate looked up at her eldest son, seeing so much of James in the set of his shoulders and the concern in his eyes. At 14, Samuel was already taller than she was, his hands growing rough from the work he'd taken on without complaint. He was trying so hard to be the man of the family, and she was trying just as hard not to let him carry burdens that should be hers alone. "Just working through some numbers," she said, gathering the papers with hands that stayed steady through force of will. "Nothing for you to worry about." But Samuel Morrison was his father's son, and like James, he could read between the lines of what wasn't being said. "The Peters family is leaving," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "Mrs. Peters came by this afternoon while you were in the garden. Said they can't take the pressure anymore, not with the little ones to think about." Kate nodded. She'd heard the rumors in town. 3 families had already pulled up stakes and headed back east, selling their claims for whatever they could get, or sometimes just walking away from land they couldn't hold. The range war was claiming casualties before the first shot was officially fired. "We're not leaving," Samuel said, and it wasn't a question. "Are we, Mama?" Kate looked at her son, this boy trying so hard to be a man, and felt the weight of all the promises she'd made settling on her shoulders like stones. To James, lying under the prairie soil. To herself, standing over his grave. To the 5 children who looked to her for answers she didn't always have. "No," she said finally. "We're not leaving. This is our home." The words felt true when she spoke them, but truth and possibility weren't always the same thing. Outside, the wind was picking up, carrying the smell of distant smoke and the promise of storms to come. Inside, 5 children slept in beds their father had built with his own hands, trusting that tomorrow would come and their mother would find a way to meet it. Kate Morrison had made her choice to stay, but staying and surviving weren't the same thing either. And as the range war gathered like thunderclouds over Clearwater Valley, she was about to discover just how far from safety a woman and 5 children could find themselves when other people's wars came calling at their door. Shooting started 3 days later, and with it, everything Kate thought she knew about protection and neutrality crumbled like autumn leaves in a hard wind. The Morrison homestead sat right in the middle of territory both sides claimed, and middle ground, she was learning, was the most dangerous place to be when bullets started flying and desperate men stopped caring about the difference between combatants and bystanders. Standing at her window that October morning, watching smoke rise from her neighbor's burning barn and listening to her children's frightened questions, Kate Morrison realized that all her careful neutrality had bought her was a front-row seat to someone else's war. The time for staying out of the fight had passed. Now the only question was whether she could keep her children alive long enough to find a way through the crossfire that was closing in around them like a noose. The morning sun climbed higher, painting the smoke-stained sky in shades of orange and red that looked too much like warnings for Kate's comfort. Somewhere in the distance, men were fighting over land and water and the right to decide how the West would be settled. And somewhere in the middle of it all, a widow with 5 children was running out of choices, running out of time, and running out of hope that neutrality could save the family she'd promised to protect. But Kate Morrison was tougher than she looked, and desperation had a way of making even the most frightened mother dangerous when her children's lives were on the line. The range war might be closing in around them, but she wasn't finished fighting yet. She just needed to figure out how to fight a war she'd never wanted to join, with weapons she didn't have, for stakes she couldn't afford to lose. Outside, the gunfire was getting closer. Inside, 5 children were counting on their mother to find a way through the storm that was breaking over Clearwater Valley like the wrath of God himself. And somewhere between the smoke and the prayers and the promises she'd made to a dead husband, Kate Morrison was about to discover that sometimes the only way to stay neutral in a war was to find someone strong enough to stand between you and the bullets, even if it meant trusting a stranger with everything you had left to lose. The decision came to Kate Morrison like lightning strikes sometimes do, sudden and sharp and leaving no room for second thoughts. She'd watched the Hendricks place burn from her kitchen window while Danny tugged at her skirts asking for breakfast. And something inside her chest went cold and practical in a way that surprised her. They couldn't stay, they couldn't fight, but they couldn't run either. Not with 5 children and winter coming fast and nowhere to go, that would welcome a widow with empty pockets and desperate eyes. That left one option she'd been avoiding since the day she buried James, one name that kept surfacing in conversations around Millfield whenever talk turned to the range war and who might survive it. Thomas Brennan owned Pine Creek Ranch 15 miles north of Clearwater Valley, close enough to the mountains to catch the early snow and far enough from the fighting to maintain the neutrality that was keeping him alive. Kate had never met Tom Brennan personally, but his reputation preceded him like morning shadows. He'd come to Wyoming territory 5 years back with money enough to buy good land and the sense to stay clear of local politics. His ranch employed both homesteaders and cattlemen's sons, and he sold beef to both factions without taking sides in their disputes. When Henry Walsh's men came calling, Brennan served them coffee and listened politely. When Jacob Stone's alliance sent representatives, they got the same treatment. Everyone knew where Pine Creek Ranch stood in the range war. Nowhere, and that's exactly how Tom Brennan wanted it. But neutrality, Kate was learning, was a luxury that required power to maintain. Brennan had money, men, and land enough to make both sides think twice before forcing his hand. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Kate Morrison had 5 children, a failing homestead, and bills that wouldn't wait for peace to be negotiated. She'd heard other things about Tom Brennan too, whispers that followed him from whatever life he'd lived before Wyoming. Some said he'd been a cavalry officer during the Indian Wars. Others claimed he'd made his money in Colorado silver mines before the veins played out. Mrs. Eleanor Price, whose husband had worked for Brennan during Roundup, said he was a fair man but hard. The kind who expected honesty and gave it in return. What everyone agreed on was that Tom Brennan kept to himself, minded his own business, and had little patience for other people's troubles, which made Kate's plan either desperate genius or complete foolishness, and she was no longer sure there was much difference between the two. The idea had come to her while she was splitting kindling behind the house, Samuel holding the logs steady while she swung the axe with more force than skill. The repetitive motion of chopping gave her mind room to wander, and somewhere between, thinking about winter fuel and winter food and winter safety, a possibility took shape that made her hands still on the axe handle. Tom Brennan needed workers. Pine Creek Ranch was prosperous enough to employ 12 men during peak season, but keeping good help was always a challenge in country where men could file homestead claims or drift to mining camps whenever wages looked better elsewhere. Kate had noticed the hiring notices posted outside Coleman's store, seasonal work that paid fair wages for men willing to work cattle and mend fence and do the 100 tasks that kept a ranch running. Kate Morrison wasn't a man, but she was willing to work. More than willing, she was desperate. And desperation, she was beginning to understand, could make a person creative in ways comfort never could. The plan that formed in her mind while she split wood was audacious enough to make her laugh, and practical enough to keep her from dismissing it outright. She couldn't offer Tom Brennan the same labor a hired man could provide, but she could offer something different. Something he might need just as much. Kate had been keeping house and raising children since she was barely older than Maggie was now. She could cook for a crew, mend clothes that saw hard use, tend gardens that fed working men, and manage the 100 domestic details that kept a ranch house running smooth. Her children weren't burdens to be tolerated, they were extra hands that could gather eggs, tend animals, help with harvest, and do the countless small jobs that always needed doing on a working ranch. More than that, Kate brought something to the table that no hired man could provide. She brought legitimacy. A ranch owner with a widow and 5 children on his payroll wasn't harboring fugitives or building a private army. He was providing honest work to a family in need, the kind of Christian charity that even warring factions could respect. Tom Brennan's neutrality was his greatest asset in a divided territory. Kate Morrison's respectability could help him protect it. The more she thought about the arrangement, the more sense it made. She needed safety, wages, and a place to weather the storm that was tearing Clearwater Valley apart. Tom Brennan needed workers, domestic help, and reasons to justify his continued neutrality to men on both sides who were starting to view fence-sitting as its own form of betrayal. It was a business arrangement, nothing more. Kate had no illusions about charity or rescue, or any of the romantic notions that might occur to women in different circumstances. She was a widow with children to feed and protect, and Tom Brennan was a rancher with problems her skills might solve. If they could help each other survive the range war, everyone benefited. If not, she'd be no worse off than she was facing winter alone on a homestead that was becoming more dangerous every day. The decision, once made, gave Kate the first peaceful sleep she'd had since the shooting started. But executing the plan required courage she wasn't sure she possessed and timing she couldn't control. She spent 2 days preparing for the journey to Pine Creek Ranch, packing what they'd need for travel and what they couldn't afford to leave behind. The children sensed something changing in their mother's manner, the way she moved through familiar tasks with new purpose. But Kate kept her plans to herself until everything was ready. Samuel found her in the barn on the 3rd morning, loading their few possessions into the wagon James had built for trips to town. The boy had grown quiet since his father's death, taking on responsibilities that aged him beyond his years, but his eyes still held the trust that made Kate's chest tight with the weight of decisions that could go wrong in 100 ways. "We're leaving," he said, and it wasn't a question. Samuel Morrison was too smart and too observant to miss the signs of preparation happening around him. "For a while," Kate agreed, checking the harness on their remaining horse. A bay mare named Patience who'd seen better days but still had heart enough for the journey ahead. There's work at Pine Creek Ranch, good work with fair wages and a safe place to stay while this trouble settles. Samuel nodded slowly, his young face working through implications Kate hoped he wouldn't fully understand. At 14, he was old enough to know that leaving their homestead meant more than temporary employment. It meant acknowledging that they couldn't hold what James Morrison had built, that the promises Kate had made at his graveside might be beyond her power to keep. "What about our place?" he asked, his voice careful in the way of children testing. "Dangerous waters." Kate looked around the barn James had raised with his own hands, the stalls he'd built for animals they could no longer afford to keep, the loft where hay should have been stored for winter feeding. Everything here carried her husband's fingerprints, his plans, his dreams for the life they'd build together. "It'll be here when we get back," she said, and hoped that was true. Sheriff Coleman will keep an eye on things, and Mrs. Price promised to check the house once a week. What she didn't say was that homesteads abandoned during range wars had a way of disappearing into other people's holdings. That absence was often interpreted as abandonment, that the land James Morrison had died working might not recognize their claim when the shooting stopped and the lawyers started sorting through what remained. Some risks were too large to speak aloud, especially to children who'd already lost one parent and needed to believe their mother could protect what their father had left behind. "Will Mr. Brennan take us all?" Maggie asked from the barn doorway. Danny balanced on her hip while Rose and Billy crowded behind her. Kate's eldest daughter had inherited her father's practical mind and her mother's protective instincts, and she understood family economics better than any 12-year-old should have to. "That's what I'm going to ask him," Kate said, lifting Danny from his sister's arms and settling him in the wagon bed, where he immediately began exploring the interesting spaces between their packed belongings. "We're going to offer our services as a family. Good honest work in exchange for wages and a place to stay." What she didn't mention was that Tom Brennan might take one look at a widow with 5 children and decide his problems weren't quite desperate enough to justify the complications they'd bring. That he might offer charity instead of employment, or employment to her but not housing for her children, or any of a dozen variations that would split her family or leave them no better off than they were facing winter alone. Kate Morrison was betting everything she had left on the hope that a neutral rancher's need for legitimacy outweighed his natural caution about taking on other people's troubles. It was a gamble with stakes too high to calculate and odds she couldn't improve, but it was the only place she could see that didn't end with her children hungry, homeless, or worse. The journey to Pine Creek Ranch took most of the day, following roads that were little more than wagon tracks winding through country that grew more rugged as they climbed toward the mountains. Kate kept the pace steady but not rushed, conscious of Patience's age and the precious cargo of children bouncing in the wagon bed behind her. They passed other travelers on the road, mostly men riding hard with the kind of purpose that suggested urgent business elsewhere. Some nodded politely as they passed. Others studied Kate's little caravan with eyes that lingered too long on what a woman and 5 children might be worth to the right buyer in troubled times. Kate kept her father's old shotgun visible on the wagon seat beside her and was grateful when such encounters ended with nothing more than awkward silence. The land began to change as they climbed higher, the grass growing thicker and the trees more numerous. Pine Creek Ranch sat in a valley that caught water from 3 mountain streams, land rich enough to support the large herds that made Tom Brennan's neutrality financially possible. Kate had heard the ranch employed nearly 20 men during peak season, making it one of the largest operations in the territory outside of Henry Walsh's cattle empire. When Pine Creek Ranch finally came into view, Kate felt her breath catch in her throat. The main house was larger than anything she'd expected. Built of logs and stone that would have taken dozens of men months to complete. Outbuildings spread across the valley floor like a small town, barns and corrals and bunkhouses that spoke of serious money and careful planning. Cattle dotted the distant pastures in numbers that made Kate's modest herd look like a child's toy. Collection. This was what success looked like in Wyoming territory, and Kate Morrison was about to ask its owner to risk it all on a widow's promise to earn her keep. Samuel whistled low from the wagon bed, his young eyes taking in the scope of the operation they were approaching. "Mama," he said quietly, "you sure about this?" Kate Morrison wasn't sure about anything except that the alternatives were worse than whatever Tom Brennan might say when she explained why a woman with 5 children and no husband had driven 15 miles to ask for work that had never been offered to someone like her. "I'm sure we need to try," she said, guiding Patience toward the main house where smoke rising from the chimney suggested someone was home to hear her proposition. Sometimes trying is all you can do. The sun was starting to settle toward the western peaks when Kate brought the wagon to a stop in front of the Pine Creek ranch house, her children silent behind her and her heart beating hard enough to shake her hands on the reins. Somewhere beyond the mountains, the range war was tearing Clearwater Valley apart. Somewhere behind them, an empty homestead waited for a family that might never return. But here, in this valley where mountain streams ran clear and cattle grazed, in peace, Kate Morrison was about to discover whether desperation could masquerade as opportunity, whether a neutral rancher's needs matched a widow's skills, and whether the gamble she was taking with her children's future would prove to be salvation or just another kind of disaster in a territory where both were separated by margins too thin to measure. The man who stepped onto the porch of the Pine Creek ranch house wasn't what Kate Morrison had expected, though she couldn't have said exactly what she'd been prepared to find. Tom Brennan was younger than she'd imagined, maybe 35, with dark hair touched by early gray at the temples and lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into sun and weather. He moved with the careful balance of someone accustomed to making quick decisions, his hand resting naturally near the Colt revolver on his hip in a way that suggested familiarity rather than threat. What struck Kate most was his stillness. While she fought to control her nervous energy and the children shifted restlessly in the wagon bed behind her, Tom Brennan simply stood and watched, taking in the scene with eyes that missed nothing and revealed less. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the kind of authority that came from being accustomed to having his words matter. "Mrs. Morrison, isn't it?" he said, stepping down from the porch with movements that were economical rather. Then hurried. "I heard about your husband. James was a good man. My condolences." Kate hadn't expected him to know her name, and the surprise must have shown on her face because something that might have been amusement flickered in Tom Brennan's expression before disappearing behind careful neutrality. "Word travels fast in small territory," he explained, approaching the wagon, but maintaining a respectful distance that acknowledged her position as a lady while keeping space for whatever business had brought her to his door, especially when it concerns neighbors. "Mr. Brennan," Kate said, grateful that her voice stayed steady despite the way her heart was hammering against her ribs. "I appreciate you taking the time to speak with me. I know you're a busy man." "Not too busy for conversation," he replied, his gaze moving briefly to the children in the wagon before returning to her face. "Though I suspect this isn't a social call." Kate had rehearsed this moment during the long ride from Clearwater Valley, planning exactly how she'd present her proposition in terms that emphasized business rather than charity. But sitting in front of Tom Brennan's substantial ranch house with 5 children depending on her words, the careful speech she'd practiced seemed insufficient for the weight of what she was asking. "No, sir, it's not," she admitted. "I've come to talk about work." Tom Brennan's eyebrows rose slightly, but his expression remained neutral. "Work," he repeated, the word carrying no inflection that might hint at his thoughts. "Yes, sir. I understand. You employ seasonal help, and I'd like to offer my services." "Our services," she corrected, gesturing toward the children who were listening to every word with the intensity of people whose Futures hung on adult conversations they couldn't control. "I see," Tom said, and Kate had the uncomfortable feeling that he saw considerably more than she'd intended to reveal. "What kind of work did you have in mind, Mrs. Morrison?" This was the moment Kate had been both dreading and anticipating, the point where her carefully constructed plan would either prove its worth or collapse under the weight of its own audacity. She straightened in the wagon seat, drawing on reserves of confidence she wasn't entirely sure she possessed. "Domestic work primarily," she said, her voice gaining strength as she fell into the rhythm of her prepared argument. "Cooking for your crew, maintaining the main house, managing supplies and provisions. Garden work, preserving, all the tasks that keep a ranch house running efficiently." Tom Brennan listened without interruption, his face giving away nothing of his thoughts. When Kate paused, he nodded once, encouraging her to continue. "My children aren't burdens, Mr. Brennan. They're additional help. Samuel here is 14 and capable of any task you'd give a grown hand. Maggie's 12 and can handle most household responsibilities. Even the younger ones can tend chickens, gather eggs, help with milking. We're not asking for charity. We're offering honest labor in exchange for fair wages and temporary housing until the situation in Clearwater Valley settles." "Temporary," Tom repeated, and now there was definitely something in his tone that Kate couldn't quite identify. "How temporary did you have in mind?" Kate felt heat rise in her cheeks. This was the part of her plan that relied more on hope than calculation, the variable she couldn't control or predict with any accuracy. "Until the range war ends," she said simply. "Until it's safe to return home and rebuild what we've lost." Tom Brennan studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes moving from her face to the children and back again. When he spoke, his words carried a weight that suggested he understood exactly what she wasn't saying. "The range war might not end the way you're hoping, Mrs. Morrison. Wars have a way of changing things permanently. People who leave their homes during troubles don't always find those homes waiting when the shooting stops." "I understand that," Kate said, though the words felt like stones in her throat. "But staying isn't an option anymore. Not with the children to consider." "No," Tom agreed quietly. "I don't suppose it is." He fell silent again, his gaze moving across the ranch spread out before them, as if seeing it through different eyes. Kate waited, her hands gripping the wagon reins hard enough to leave marks, while 5 children held their breath behind her, and the future balanced on whatever decision was forming behind Tom Brennan's careful expression. "I do need domestic help," he said finally. "My current arrangement isn't working out as well as I'd hoped." Kate felt something loosen in her chest, a knot of tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. But Tom Brennan wasn't finished speaking. "However," he continued, and the word fell between them like a gate swinging shut, "taking on a family during wartime isn't a decision I can make lightly. It affects more than just my household. It affects my standing with both factions, my ability to maintain the neutrality that keeps this ranch safe, and the safety of everyone who works here." "I understand your concerns," Kate said carefully. "But consider this, Mr. Brennan. Employing a widow and her children isn't taking sides in the range war. It's demonstrating the kind of Christian values that both sides claim to represent. Henry Walsh and Jacob Stone might disagree about land rights and water access, but neither one wants to be seen as the man who drove a grieving family into destitution." Tom Brennan's mouth quirked upward in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "You've thought this through?" "Yes, sir, I have. And if I say no, what then?" The question hit Kate like a physical blow, forcing her to confront the possibility she'd been trying not to acknowledge during the long ride from Clearwater Valley. If Tom Brennan turned them away, her options narrowed to choices no mother should have to make. "Then we'll find another way," she said, the words coming out steadier than she felt. "We always do." But Tom Brennan was studying her with eyes that suggested he could read between the lines of her careful composure. And Kate had the uncomfortable feeling that her brave words weren't fooling anyone, least of all herself. "The work is hard," he said suddenly, changing direction in a way that left Kate scrambling to follow his meaning. Ranch cooking means feeding 20 men 3 times a day during peak season. The house is large and gets dirty fast with working men tracking through. The garden needs constant attention, and preserving season is 3 months of dawn to dark. Labor. This isn't keeping house for a family of 6, Mrs. Morrison. This is running the domestic operations of a working ranch. "I can handle it," Kate said, and was surprised by the conviction in her own voice. "Can you?" Tom asked, but he wasn't challenging her capability. He was testing her understanding of what she was volunteering for. "What about when one of your children gets sick? What about when Samuel wants to work with the men instead of helping his mother? What about when the younger ones get homesick and start crying for the father who isn't coming back?" Each question was a small blade, cutting close to fears Kate had been trying not to examine too closely. But she'd come too far and risked too much to let fear turn her back now. "Then I'll deal with those problems as they come," she said. "The same way I've been dealing with everything else since James died. One day at a time, one crisis at a time, one decision at a time." Tom Brennan nodded slowly, as if her answer had confirmed something he'd been wondering about. "Show me your hands," he said unexpectedly. Kate blinked in confusion. "Sir?" "Your hands. Show me." Kate pulled off her work gloves and extended her hands, palm up, for Tom Brennan's inspection. Her fingers were stained with garden soil that never quite washed clean, her palms marked with calluses from axe handles and rope burns from controlling livestock. Small cuts and scrapes covered her knuckles, the accumulated damage of months spent doing work her husband had once handled. Tom Brennan studied her hands for a moment, then nodded with what might have been approval. "Those are working hands," he said. "Not soft enough to be afraid of hard labor." "No, sir, they're not." "The children," he said, turning his attention to the wagon bed where Samuel, Maggie, Billy, Rose, and Danny sat watching the adult conversation with expressions ranging from hopeful to anxious. "They're all healthy?" "Yes, sir." "Strong children?" "All of them." "Samuel," Tom called, addressing Kate's eldest son directly. "You know anything about cattle?" Samuel straightened under the direct attention, his young shoulders squaring in a way that reminded Kate painfully of his father. "Some, sir. We kept a small herd before Papa died." "Ever worked roundup? Branding? Moving cattle between pastures?" "No, sir, not on a large scale. But I'm willing to learn whatever you need me to know." Tom Brennan studied the boy for a moment, then turned his attention to Maggie. "And you, miss? Your mother says you can handle household responsibilities. What does that mean, exactly?" Maggie lifted her chin with dignity that was entirely her own. "I can cook simple meals, sir. Clean house, tend the garden, mind the younger children. I've been helping Mama since I was old enough to reach the stove." "The little ones," Tom said, his gaze settling on Billy, Rose, and Danny. "They listen to their mother? Follow instructions without argument?" "Most of the time," Kate said. "Honestly, they're children, Mr. Brennan. Good children, but not angels." "Angels wouldn't be much use on a working ranch anyway," Tom replied, and this time the amusement in his expression was unmistakable. He fell silent again, his gaze moving from the family in the wagon to the ranch buildings spread across the valley, as if calculating costs and benefits that only he could see. Kate waited, her children waited, and somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed in pastures that had been bought and paid for with the kind of success Kate could only dream about. 3 months, Tom Brennan said finally. "Trial employment. You'll manage my household, cook for the crew, supervise domestic operations. Samuel can work with the men when his help is needed, but his primary responsibility is to his family. The younger children will stay close to the house unless specifically assigned tasks elsewhere." Kate felt her heart jump, but Tom Brennan wasn't finished outlining his terms. Wages will be fair, but not generous. Housing will be the small cabin behind the main house, currently used for storage. It'll need cleaning and basic repairs, but it's sound and will keep you dry and warm. Food for the family comes from ranch supplies, within reason. No alcohol, no entertaining visitors without permission, no involvement in range war politics. From either side. And after 3 months? Kate asked, though she was afraid to hear the answer. After 3 months, we'll evaluate how the arrangement is working for everyone involved. If you've proven yourself valuable, and I've proven to be a fair employer, we'll discuss longer terms. If not, I'll give you 2 weeks' notice and help you find other employment. It wasn't the security Kate had hoped for, but it was more than she'd dared expect when she'd started the journey that morning. 3 months was enough time for the range war to settle, enough time to prove her worth, enough time to plan whatever came next. "Mr. Brennan," she said, extending her work-scarred hand toward him, "you have a deal." Tom Brennan stepped forward and took her hand in a grip that was firm without being crushing, businesslike without being cold. "Welcome to Pine Creek Ranch, Mrs. Morrison. Let's see what we can build together." As he helped her down from the wagon and began directing Samuel toward the barn where patients could be unharnessed and fed, Kate Morrison felt something she hadn't experienced since the morning she'd buried her husband. She felt hope. Not the desperate, grasping hope of someone with no other options, but the steady, practical hope of someone who'd been given a chance to prove their worth. The range war was still raging in Clearwater Valley. Her homestead was still sitting, empty, vulnerable to whatever dangers came with abandoned property in troubled times. Winter was still coming, and the future beyond Tom Brennan's 3-month trial period was still uncertain. But for the first time since James Morrison had died, Kate and her 5 children had a place where they belonged, at least temporarily. They had work to do, wages to earn, and a man willing to judge them on their abilities rather than their circumstances. It wasn't everything she'd dreamed of when she'd married James Morrison and followed him west. But it was enough to start rebuilding from, enough to hold on to while she figured out what came next, enough to prove that widowhood and motherhood didn't have to mean helplessness. As evening settled over Pine Creek Ranch and Tom Brennan showed them to the cabin that would be their new home, Kate Morrison allowed herself to believe that sometimes desperate gambles paid off in ways that looked remarkably like answered prayers. The first test came 6 weeks after Kate Morrison and her children had settled into their new life at Pine Creek Ranch, arriving in the form of 20 riders who appeared on the ridge overlooking the valley just as the November sun was breaking through morning clouds. Kate was hanging laundry behind the main house when she spotted them, dark figures silhouetted against the sky like harbingers of trouble she'd been expecting, but hoping wouldn't find them. She didn't run. 6 weeks of working for Tom Brennan had taught her that panic was a luxury Pine Creek Ranch couldn't afford, that the neutrality protecting them all depended on maintaining the appearance of normal ranch operations even when normal was the last thing anyone felt. Instead, she gathered the wet clothes back into her basket with steady hands and walked calmly toward the main house, where Tom was likely finishing his morning coffee and planning the day's work. The kitchen door opened before she reached it, and Tom Brennan stepped onto the back porch with the kind of alertness that suggested he'd been watching the ridge as carefully as she had. His face showed no surprise at seeing the riders, only the grim resignation of a man who'd been expecting this moment since the day he'd agreed to shelter a widow and her children. "Mrs. Morrison," he said quietly, his voice carrying the authority that had become familiar during their weeks of working together. "I need you to gather the children and keep them in the cabin until I tell you otherwise." Kate nodded, understanding, flowing between them without need for explanation. Whatever business those riders brought to Pine Creek Ranch, it wasn't the kind that benefited from having children underfoot or women asking questions that had no safe answers. Samuel's with the men checking fence along the north pasture, she said, setting down her laundry basket with hands that betrayed none of the fear coursing through her chest. Should I send word? No. Tom's response was immediate and final. The boy's safer where he is. If trouble starts, the hands know to keep him clear until it's settled. Kate felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November air. In 6 weeks of working for Tom Brennan, she'd never heard him speak of trouble in terms of when rather than if. Never seen the careful mask of neutrality slip enough to reveal the calculations happening behind his steady exterior. "Mr. Brennan," she said, her voice dropping to match his quiet tone. "Who are they?" Tom's eyes remained fixed on the ridge where the riders were beginning their descent toward the ranch buildings, moving with the purposeful cadence of men who'd come to settle business rather than discuss it. Henry Walsh and his foreman, plus enough guns to make their point clear, he said. Along with 3 men I don't recognize, which means they're either hired muscle or representatives from the Cattlemen's Association. Neither option suggests this visit will be purely social. Kate felt her stomach tighten. Henry Walsh was the driving force behind the range war that had destroyed her peaceful life in Clearwater Valley. The man whose determination to control open grazing rights had turned neighbor against neighbor and forced families like hers to choose between fighting and fleeing. His presence at Pine Creek Ranch meant the war was expanding beyond its original boundaries, reaching into territory that had seemed safely neutral. "What do they want?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Same thing Jacob Stone's people wanted when they came calling last month while you were in town with the children," Tom replied. "They want me to pick a side. The difference is, Walsh has enough men behind him to make his request considerably more persuasive than Stone's diplomatic overtures." Kate had known about Jacob Stone's visit, had seen the tension in Tom's shoulders for days afterward, and felt the way the ranch hands had moved with extra caution, checking weapons and watching the horizon with increased vigilance. But she hadn't understood the full implications of that meeting until now. Hadn't realized that Tom Brennan's careful neutrality was becoming a liability, rather than an asset, as the range war escalated beyond anyone's ability to control. "What? Will you tell them?" she asked. Tom finally looked away from the approaching riders, his dark eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "The same thing I told Stone, that Pine Creek Ranch remains neutral in other people's quarrels, that I employ good men regardless of their politics, and that anyone seeking to change that arrangement will need to present compelling reasons for why I should risk everything I've built for the privilege of choosing sides in a war that benefits no one. And if compelling reasons aren't enough?" The question hung between them like smoke from a distant fire, carrying implications neither wanted to examine too closely. Tom Brennan had built his success on the foundation of careful neutrality. But neutrality was a position that required strength to maintain. If Henry Walsh had brought enough men to Pine Creek Ranch, compelling reasons might prove less relevant than superior firepower. Then we'll discover whether a man's word means anything when it's backed by hired guns instead of honest conviction, Tom said quietly. "But that's my problem to solve, Mrs. Morrison. Your job is to keep your children safe and let me handle whatever business Walsh thinks he has with me." Kate wanted to argue, wanted to point out that her family's safety was directly tied to Tom Brennan's ability to maintain his neutral stance, that their fate was bound up with his in ways that made his problems her problems whether he acknowledged it or not. But the riders were close enough now that individual faces could be distinguished, and the time for discussion was running out faster than either of them could control. "Be careful," she said instead, the words carrying more weight than their simplicity suggested. "Always am," Tom replied, but his slight smile held an edge that suggested careful might not be enough when 20 armed men came calling with agendas that brooked no compromise. Kate gathered her children with efficiency born of necessity, explaining the situation in terms that conveyed urgency without panic. Maggie understood immediately, her 12-year-old mind grasping the adult complexities of territorial politics. With clarity that sometimes surprised her mother, Billy and Rose accepted their mother's instructions to stay inside without argument, though their eyes held questions Kate couldn't answer. Danny, at 4, was simply happy to have an excuse to play with his wooden blocks on the cabin floor instead of helping with chores. From the cabin's single window, Kate watched Henry Walsh and his men ride into the ranch yard with the kind of swagger that suggested they considered themselves the rightful owners of everything they surveyed. Walsh himself was a big man, broad-shouldered and commanding, with iron-gray hair and eyes that held the cold calculation of someone accustomed to getting his way through force when persuasion failed. Tom Brennan met them in the center of the yard, flanked by 2 of his most trusted hands, but outnumbered 4-1 by visitors whose intentions were written in the casual way they kept their hands near their weapons. The conversation that followed was too distant for Kate to hear individual words, but the body language spoke volumes about the nature of the discussion taking place. Walsh did most of the talking, his gestures broad and emphatic, the kind of presentation designed to overwhelm objections through sheer force of personality. Tom listened without interruption, his own posture conveying respectful attention that revealed nothing of his thoughts or intentions. When Walsh finished his pitch, Tom's response was brief and apparently unsatisfactory, judging by the way Walsh's face darkened and his men shifted in their saddles. The second round of conversation was more heated, with Walsh leaning forward in his saddle and Tom's hands moving to rest casually on his gun belt, a gesture that was neither threatening nor submissive, but simply prepared. Kate found herself holding her breath, watching adult negotiations that could determine whether her children had a home tomorrow or found themselves refugees again, fleeing violence they'd done nothing to provoke. The turning point came when one of Walsh's men, a lean gunfighter with pale eyes and a reputation that preceded him throughout the territory, made some comment that caused Tom's entire demeanor to shift. Where before he'd been diplomatically neutral, now he was coldly angry. The kind of anger that didn't raise voices but made smart men reconsider their positions. Tom's response was clearly visible, even from Kate's distant vantage point. He stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and Walsh's horse, and spoke words that carried across the yard with the clarity of mountain air. Kate couldn't make out everything he said, but she heard enough to understand that Tom Brennan was drawing lines that wouldn't be crossed, establishing boundaries that would be enforced regardless of the odds against him. "This ranch remains neutral," his voice carried to the cabin window where Kate strained to listen. "Any man who wants to change that arrangement can try, but he'd better be prepared for the consequences of forcing honest people to choose between their principles and their safety." Walsh's reply was lost in the wind, but his tone suggested threats barely concealed beneath the veneer of civilized discourse. Whatever he said caused Tom's hands to shift slightly, a movement so subtle that only someone who'd been watching carefully would notice, the way his fingers positioned themselves for quick access to his weapons. The standoff stretched for minutes that felt like hours, 20 armed men facing 3, with the fate of Pine Creek Ranch's neutrality hanging in the balance. Kate found herself praying for wisdom she couldn't provide and strength she couldn't give, watching helplessly as the man who'd offered her family sanctuary risked everything he'd built to protect principles that might prove more expensive than anyone could afford. The resolution, when it came, was anticlimactic in the way of most real confrontations. Walsh said something final and decisive, wheeled his horse around, and led his men back toward the ridge they'd descended less than an hour earlier. But the threat in their departure was unmistakable, written in the way they looked back at the ranch buildings and the casual manner in which they displayed weapons that had never quite been drawn but never quite been forgotten either. Tom Brennan stood in the yard until the riders disappeared over the ridge, then walked slowly back toward the house with the measured pace of a man thinking through implications that extended far beyond the Immediate confrontation when he knocked. On the cabin door, Kate opened it to find his face wearing the kind of expression that suggested the easy part of their troubles was finished and the hard part was about to begin. "They're gone," he said simply, stepping inside the cabin where 5 children waited for news that would determine the shape of their immediate future. "For now," Kate replied, reading between the lines of what he wasn't saying. "For now, Tom." Agreed. Walsh made his position clear. He wants Pine Creek Ranch to join the Cattlemen's Association, contribute men and resources to their cause, and cease all employment of anyone with homesteader sympathies. Kate felt her heart sink. Samuel had been working with men who'd filed homestead claims, learning skills that might serve him well if they ever returned to Clearwater Valley. More than that, Tom's refusal to discriminate based on political affiliations was one of the things that made Pine Creek Ranch genuinely neutral rather than simply uncommitted. "And you told him no?" "I told him that Pine Creek Ranch employs good men, regardless of their politics, that we maintain neutrality in conflicts that don't concern us, and that any attempt to force our participation in his war would be met with appropriate resistance." How did he take that? Tom's smile held no humor whatsoever, about as well as you'd expect. "He gave me 48 hours to reconsider my position, after which he'll assume that continued neutrality represents active opposition to the Cattlemen's Association and respond accordingly." Kate sank into the room's single chair, the full weight of their situation settling over her like a lead blanket. Tom Brennan had risked his ranch, his livelihood, and potentially his life to maintain the principles that made Pine Creek Ranch a safe haven for families like hers. Now those same principles were about to make them all targets in a war that was expanding beyond anyone's ability to control. "What happens in 48 hours?" she asked, though she was afraid to hear the answer. "We find out whether neutrality can survive when both sides decide it's no longer convenient," Tom replied, "and whether the choices we make when everything's at stake prove we're the people we've been pretending to be." Outside, wind whistled through the pine trees that gave the ranch its name, carrying the scent of snow from the high peaks and the promise of winter storms that would soon make travel difficult for armies as well as families. Inside the cabin, Kate Morrison looked at the man who'd offered her children sanctuary and realized that the safety they'd found at Pine Creek Ranch was about to be tested in ways none of them had anticipated. The range war was coming to them whether they'd chosen sides or not, and the next 48 hours would determine whether Tom Brennan's commitment to neutrality was strong enough to protect the people who'd trusted him with their lives, or whether principle was a luxury that couldn't survive when survival itself was at stake. Samuel returned from the north pasture as evening settled over the valley, his young face grave with the knowledge that adult conversations had been happening in his absence. The ranch hands who'd been with him moved with the quiet efficiency of men preparing for trouble, checking weapons and securing livestock with the kind of attention to detail that suggested they understood exactly what Henry Walsh's visit meant for everyone who called Pine Creek Ranch home. That night, Kate Morrison lay awake listening to the sound of guards walking their rounds and wondering whether the sanctuary they'd found was about to become the battleground they'd fled, whether the man who'd offered them safety possessed the strength to deliver on promises that were proving more expensive than anyone had calculated when the agreement was made. The answer came not from Henry Walsh or his hired guns, but from an unexpected source that arrived at Pine Creek Ranch 36 hours after the ultimatum had been delivered. Kate was teaching Rose her letters at the kitchen table when the sound of multiple horses approaching sent her to the window, her heart racing with the fear that Walsh had returned early with reinforcement and violence. Instead, she found herself looking at a delegation unlike any she'd seen since arriving at the ranch. Father O'Brien rode at the front, his black coat and clerical collar immediately recognizable even at distance. Behind him came Sheriff Coleman. From Millfield, two men in the dark suits that marked them as territorial officials, and most surprisingly, Jacob Stone himself, leader of the Homesteaders Alliance that had been fighting Walsh's cattlemen across 3 counties. Tom Brennan emerged from the barn where he'd been checking equipment with the focused intensity of a man preparing for siege. His face showed surprise at the composition of the approaching party, but Kate caught the subtle relaxation in his shoulders. That suggested this unexpected arrival might represent opportunity rather than additional threat. "Father O'Brien," Tom called out as the riders approached the main house. "Sheriff Coleman, Mr. Stone, this is an interesting collection of traveling companions." Father O'Brien dismounted with the careful movements of a man who'd spent more hours in the saddle during recent weeks than his aging frame preferred. As the priest who served churches throughout the scattered communities of the territory, he'd witnessed firsthand the damage the range war was inflicting on families caught between competing claims to land and water rights. "Mr. Brennan," the priest replied, his Irish accent lending warmth to words that carried serious intent. "We've come to discuss a matter of mutual interest, one that might benefit everyone involved in this unfortunate conflict." Sheriff Coleman stepped forward, his badge catching afternoon sunlight, and his expression holding the weary authority of a lawman dealing with problems that had grown beyond his ability to solve through traditional enforcement. "Tom, we need to talk, all of us together, about ending this war before it destroys everything decent folks have built in this territory." Kate watched from the kitchen window as Tom's expression shifted from wariness to cautious interest. Jacob Stone, Walsh's primary opponent in the range war, nodded respectfully toward Tom but said nothing, his presence speaking louder than words about the significance of whatever proposal had brought these unlikely allies to Pine Creek Ranch. "Kate," Tom called toward the house, his voice carrying the authority she'd learned to recognize when ranch business required her attention. "Would you mind preparing coffee for our guests? And perhaps some of those biscuits the men have been praising?" Kate understood the request carried implications beyond simple hospitality. Tom was inviting her to remain present for whatever discussion was about to unfold, trusting her discretion and perhaps recognizing that her family's fate was tied to whatever decisions emerged from this unexpected gathering. As she prepared refreshments, Kate listened to the conversation developing on the front porch, catching fragments of discussion that suggested solutions she hadn't dared hope might be possible. "The territorial governor has been following the situation with increasing concern," one of the officials was explaining to Tom. "Washington doesn't appreciate conflicts that threaten federal land policy and discourage settlement. There's pressure from Congress to resolve this matter before it spreads to other territories." Father O'Brien's voice carried the moral authority that had made him a respected mediator in community disputes. "Both sides have suffered losses, Tom. Families driven from their homes, property destroyed, young men killed in conflicts that serve no one's true interests. The time has come to find common ground before more blood is shed." Jacob Stone spoke for the first time since arriving, his words careful and measured. "Mr. Brennan, your neutrality in this conflict has given you something both sides need: credibility, trust, the ability to host negotiations without either faction feeling they're entering enemy territory." Tom's response was thoughtful, revealing the careful consideration he applied to decisions that affected not only his own interests, but those of everyone who depended on Pine Creek Ranch for safety and livelihood. "What exactly are you proposing?" he asked. Sheriff Coleman answered, his official status lending weight to words that carried the force of territorial law. "A negotiated settlement. Mediated discussions held here at your ranch, with representatives from both sides working toward an agreement that acknowledges legitimate claims while ending the violence. The territorial government is prepared to offer incentives," the second official added. "Water rights guarantees for established homesteaders, expanded grazing permits for cattlemen who respect filed claims, and federal assistance for families whose property has been damaged during the conflict. Kate felt her breath catch. Federal assistance for damaged property might mean support for families like hers who'd lost livestock, equipment, and buildings to the range war's escalating violence. More importantly, a negotiated settlement might mean safety for the children, who'd been living under the constant threat of renewed conflict. Tom was quiet for several minutes, considering implications that extended far beyond the immediate proposal. When he spoke, his words revealed the depth of thought he'd given to problems that affected the entire territory. Mediation requires neutral ground and neutral authority, he said slowly. I can provide the first, but I'm not sure I possess the second. Men who've been killing each other don't make peace because a rancher asks them to be reasonable. That's where we come in, Father O'Brien said gently. I'll provide spiritual authority and moral suasion. Sheriff Coleman represents territorial law. These gentlemen carry the weight of federal government backing. Together, we can create the framework for meaningful negotiations. And if Walsh refuses to participate, Tom asked. His ultimatum expires in 12 hours. He's not likely to appreciate discovering that his deadline has been superseded by territorial intervention. Jacob Stone's answer surprised everyone. With its directness, Henry Walsh is a businessman before he's a warrior. If we can present him with a settlement that protects his legitimate interests while ending a conflict that's costing him money and men, he'll negotiate. The key is offering him a way to accept terms without appearing to surrender to Homesteader demands. Kate emerged from the house carrying a tray of coffee and fresh biscuits, her presence providing a natural pause in discussions that were reshaping the future of everyone affected by the range war. As she served the unexpected delegation, she caught Tom's eye and saw something there she'd never seen before. Hope, real, substantial hope that the crisis threatening to destroy Pine Creek Ranch's neutrality might instead become the foundation for lasting peace. Mrs. Morrison, Father O'Brien said as she handed him his coffee, his kind eyes acknowledging her family's situation with the understanding that came from ministering to communities torn apart by conflict. How are you and the children managing through these difficult times? We're managing well, Father, Kate replied truthfully. Mr. Brennan has provided good work and safe shelter. We're grateful for both. Sheriff Coleman studied her with the professional assessment of a lawman who'd seen too many families displaced by violence. I remember your husband, ma'am. James Morrison was a good man. His death was a loss to the entire territory. Thank you, Sheriff. James believed this territory could be home to cattlemen and homesteaders both, if people were willing to work together instead of fighting over differences. Jacob Stone nodded thoughtfully. Your husband was wise, Mrs. Morrison. That's exactly what we're hoping to accomplish through these negotiations. The conversation that followed lasted 3 hours, covering details of territorial law, federal land policy, water rights, and the complex web of claims and counterclaims that had fueled months of violence. Kate listened while managing household tasks, understanding more than she'd expected about the legal and economic issues underlying the range war. By evening, the framework for negotiations had been established. Pine Creek Ranch would host a week of mediated discussions beginning the following Monday. Father O'Brien would provide spiritual guidance and moral authority. Sheriff Coleman would ensure legal compliance and enforce peace during the talks. The territorial officials would facilitate federal support for any agreements reached. Most importantly, Tom Brennan's neutrality had been transformed from a liability, threatening his survival, into an asset crucial to territorial peace. Instead of being forced to choose sides in a destructive conflict, he'd become the foundation for ending it. As the delegation prepared to leave, Sheriff Coleman pulled Tom aside for a private conversation that Kate observed from the kitchen window. Whatever passed between them seemed to satisfy both men, with Coleman nodding firmly and Tom's shoulders losing the tension that had marked his posture since Walsh's ultimatum. When the visitors had gone, Tom found Kate in the kitchen where she was cleaning the coffee cups and preparing supper for her family. His expression held relief mixed with anticipation, the look of a man who'd discovered that problems sometimes resolved in ways that exceeded anyone's reasonable expectations. "Well," he said, settling into the chair she'd learned was his preferred spot for serious conversations. "It appears Pine Creek Ranch is about to become the center of territorial politics instead of a target for territorial violence. Do you think it will work?" Kate asked, setting aside her dish rag and giving him the attention his news deserved. "Can they really negotiate an end to the range war?" "I think they can if both sides want peace more than they want victory," Tom replied. "And I think most people are tired enough of the fighting to give compromise a genuine chance." Kate felt something ease in her chest, a knot of worry that had been tightening since the morning Walsh had delivered his ultimatum. "What does this mean for us? For my family?" Tom's answer carried weight that suggested he'd been considering their situation as carefully as the larger territorial implications. "It means you're no longer refugees from someone else's war. It means the work you've been doing here has value beyond simple employment. And it means your children might have a future in this territory that doesn't require choosing between safety and the land their father died working." "The homestead," Kate said quietly, voicing hope she'd been afraid to acknowledge even to herself. "If there's a negotiated settlement, if the violence ends, then families who fled the fighting might be able to return home," Tom finished, "with federal assistance to rebuild what was lost and legal guarantees that their claims will be respected." Kate looked around the kitchen where she'd learned to cook for ranch crews, where she'd found purpose and dignity in honest work that provided for her children. The cabin behind the main house had become home in ways she hadn't expected, and the thought of leaving brought emotions she wasn't prepared to examine. "What about Pine Creek Ranch?" she asked. "What about the work here?" Tom's smile held understanding of complications that went beyond simple employment arrangements. "Pine Creek Ranch will always need domestic management, Mrs. Morrison. The question is whether you'll want to continue providing it once you have other options available." The question hung between them like morning mist, carrying implications neither was quite ready to address directly. Kate had found more than work at Pine Creek Ranch. She'd found partnership with a man who respected her capabilities, valued her contributions, and treated her children as assets rather than burdens. Tom Brennan had proven himself to be exactly the kind of man James Morrison would have trusted with his family's welfare. But Kate Morrison was still a woman with land of her own, a homestead that represented her late husband's dreams and her children's inheritance. The peace negotiations might restore that possibility, giving her family the chance to return to the life they'd built before the range war destroyed their security. "That's a decision for another day," she said finally. "First, let's see if territorial officials can accomplish what they've promised." "Agreed," Tom said, "though I should mention that successful mediation might lead to other opportunities. The territorial government will need administrators for the assistance programs they're offering, people with practical experience managing complex operations, understanding both sides of the conflict, and demonstrating the judgment to work with diverse communities." Kate understood the suggestion he was making, the possibility that her experience at Pine Creek Ranch might qualify her for positions that could provide long-term security for her family while contributing to the territory's development. It was a future she'd never imagined when she'd driven her children away from Clearwater Valley, but one that felt both possible and appealing. The negotiations began as scheduled the following Monday, transforming Pine Creek Ranch into the political center of the territory as representatives from both factions arrived with the lawyers, witnesses, and documentation necessary for complex discussions. Kate found herself managing logistics that went far beyond normal household responsibilities, coordinating meals, housing, and meeting spaces for men who'd been shooting at each other weeks earlier. The children adapted to their expanded responsibilities with enthusiasm that surprised her. Samuel worked alongside Tom's regular hands, learning skills that would serve him well whether the family returned to homesteading or remained at the ranch. Maggie managed younger children and household tasks with competence that freed Kate to focus on the demanding requirements of hosting territorial negotiations. Even Billy, Rose, and Danny contributed to the peaceful atmosphere by demonstrating that the ranch was home to families, not just fighting men. Their presence reminded all the negotiators that the stakes in these discussions included children's futures, not just adult pride and political positions. The breakthrough came on Thursday evening when Henry Walsh and Jacob Stone shook hands over an agreement that acknowledged homesteader rights while protecting legitimate grazing interests. Federal assistance would help rebuild damaged property. Territorial law would protect both cattle and crops, and the violence that had torn the territory apart would end with legal guarantees instead of military victory. Father O'Brien pronounced a blessing over the signed agreements. Sheriff Coleman pledged enforcement support, and the territorial officials promised federal backing for implementation. Most importantly, Tom Brennan's neutrality had not only survived the crisis but had become the foundation for lasting peace. As the negotiating parties prepared to return to their communities with news of the settlement, Kate Morrison stood in the kitchen of Pine Creek Ranch and realized that she'd found something she hadn't been looking for when she'd driven her children away from the range war's violence. She'd found a future that honored her past while embracing possibilities she'd never imagined. The homestead in Clearwater Valley would always be part of her family's story, but Pine Creek Ranch had become home in ways that went beyond simple shelter from conflict. Whether she chose to rebuild James Morrison's dreams or build new ones alongside Tom Brennan, her children would grow up knowing that courage and determination could create security from chaos, that honest work could restore dignity lost to circumstances beyond anyone's control. Winter was coming to Wyoming territory, but it would arrive peacefully for the first time in months. Families could return to abandoned homesteads, cattlemen could move herds without fear of ambush, and children could grow up in a territory where differences were settled through law rather than violence. And in the kitchen of Pine Creek Ranch, a widow who'd fled one war and helped end another prepared supper for her family and the man who'd proven that neutrality backed by principle could triumph over conflict driven by greed and fear. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.